Good afternoon. I'm Heather Hughes, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us today for our Partnering for Success webinar series. Today, we will be discussing professional and proven hiring practices. We will be recording today's webinar, and we will be distributing a link to this to all registered participants. As we progress through the presentation, please feel free to ask questions. We will be addressing your questions as they are received. Our presenter today is John Grubbs with MTAS. John has served in management, human resources, and consulting roles for more than 35 years in the public and private sectors. He has served multiple organizations as HR director, including 2 Tennessee cities, those being White House and Portland. He has been with MTAS since 2015 and currently serves as the HR consultant for Middle Tennessee. He holds a master's in human resources management from the University of Connecticut and is currently a master's candidate in industrial organizational psychology at Austin Peay State University. He also holds senior level certifications from the HR Certification Institute, SPHR, Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM-SCP, and the Public Sector Human Resources Association, IPMA-SCP. So without further ado, I give you John Grubbs.
Thanks, Heather. It's good to be here. Like Heather said, we're going to be talking today about some foundational things. We're going to talk about, I'm going to go ahead and put this up here. Some foundation topics. We're going to talk about some of the attributes or some of the things in the legal landscape in the selection process when you hire people, when you move them in, through, and up and out of your organization. We're going to talk about some of the functional things that happen when you analyze jobs so that you can be compliant with the legal landscape. And as you put together job descriptions, as you put together an understanding of how people have to perform the work or must perform the work and are required to perform the work in your organization, how you put those things to documentation. And building on those, we're going to look at some tools, some techniques that help you predict job success when you hire people, when you promote people. And we're going to kind of end with some pre-employment steps that you take after you've brought you've offered the position, you've offered the job to the person, and the last things you do before you bring them on board, and how all those comport with your personnel policies and the importance of personnel policies. We're going to talk a little bit about those things as well. So as we get started, like Heather said, there are a couple of options or opportunities throughout to do some polls, and we'll be answering questions. But until we get to the questions and answer stops along the way, I'm going to go ahead and mute my video because I have this habit of talking with my hands and I can be distracting. So those of you that know me understand that. So I'm going to stop the video. All right, so the first poll that we're going to have before we get started, I'm curious, does your organization collect applicant voluntary data on ethnicity, gender, veteran status, or disability?
I have launched this poll. Just let me know when you would like the results, John.
Okay, give them a few minutes. Just whenever you're comfortable that we've got enough responses from our participants.
Looks like we've leveled out a bit, and we're at about 67% no and 33% yes.
Okay, 67% no, 33% yes. So approximately a third of you do collect that information. 2/3 of you do not. Now, it's interesting. I would be curious at some point if we were having a conversation of why you've chosen to and why your city has chosen not to. But it's good information to have if you know how to use it, if you use it correctly. Obviously, anytime somebody is asked to submit this, and the example that I've got up here is actually an EEO1 voluntary form, and we don't do EEO1s annually in local government. But you do have to do a biennial EEO4 report, and this could be good information to gather that data internally. Obviously, if a person does not voluntarily submit, you can observe them and put them in a category based on observation so that you can run some analysis later. Analysis is important, and we'll get to that. It's very important that you observe your population, your internal population of your workforce, and how it mirrors the population of your constituents that you serve and the broader area that you recruit from. You'll look at your applicant flow, your applicant stock, and other things if you were to engage in those practices. Obviously, when you ask for this information, it's kept separately from a job application. They don't have to turn this in, but it's good data to submit if you use it appropriately. And I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts of that use, but we here at MTAS, and I'll give you our contact information at the end, the HR consultants here at MTAS can help you navigate those waters when it comes to that point. But the basis of the legal landscape, at least, what we're talking about today, I want to start with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. I also want to touch on uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures. So Title VII came about and has been amended several times. The last, I think, being 1991. With the Lilly Ledbetter Act happening in 2009, I'm just going to go ahead forward to this slide. It prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. So it's kind of like that. I always liken it to the legislative version of the tag that you find on your hair dryer saying, don't dry your hair in the bathtub. It's because we've done historically some things that are not permissible, that are not good in selection. And it was the first legislation to regulate how we select people and to tell us that we are not to select people based on membership in protected classes. We're not to treat them disparately, disparate treatment. We're going to get to that in a minute. And we'll go back to this slide for a moment. As you see, we've got disparate treatment highlighted here, and we've got disparate impact. Disparate impact is a measure that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And the courts struggled when the legislation was passed in the 60s. By the 1970s, the court struggled with, well, how do we measure outcomes instead of known bad treatment? So they came up with the term disparate impact that arose out of a case we're going to talk about in a few minutes. In the late 70s, 3 or 4 agencies got together and came up with uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures. Now, I want to highlight that a local government, an employer in general, unless you're a federal contractor and subject to Executive Order 11246 and the Office of Federal Contractor Compliance programs, this does not have force of law, but it is used in the courts as a litmus test on whether or not you're following, regulated and prescribed practices. Again, it's not something we're going to get into heavily today, but it's something you need to be made aware of, and you can always Google it, look it up, US Code 29, UGESP, and you can read through it. It's a long document, but it does define what selection tests are. So on the disparate treatment side, the side where we treat people differently, that's direct discrimination, where we unequally treat people because we don't like them. They're different from us. They're members of groups that are unlike us, and we treat them differently. It's intentional. We take prejudice actions. We apply different standards to people. But we're pretty good about that. The EEOC data indicates that we've made gains in disparate treatment. But anytime there's a claim of employment discrimination, there's usually a disparate impact portion of that, because attorneys typically, nothing against anyone who's an attorney, but an attorney working on contingency who's representing a complainant is likely to throw the kitchen sink at it. to include both disparate treatment and disparate impact, and ask for your measures. Like I said, disparate treatment is an easy thing to refute, relatively easy thing to refute. There's a burden shifting analysis. So the complainant makes out a facially valid, a prima facie case, which means that they're a member of a protected class. They were qualified for and applied for an available position or promotion. And despite being qualified, they were rejected for the position. And the position remained available after the rejection happened. So the burden at that point rests on the employer to produce evidence that they had a legitimate non-discriminatory business reason for their action. So this is called the McDonnell-Douglas standard, and it requires the employee, or the applicant in this case, or the person applying for a promotion, demonstrate just a basis, and then the employer can shift the burden back to them once they've articulated a legitimate non-discriminatory reason. And at that point in time, the plaintiff has to demonstrate that the reason was pretext. That's pretty hard to prove. So that's a pretty cut and dried standard. But once we get into disparate impact, it gets a little bit more complicated. So disparate impact happens when you have groups of people that are unintentionally treated differently. And when they're unintentionally treated differently, you have to measure that statistically. And that's why collecting some of this data on the front end is very important. You measure the equality of consequences or results to groups. This came about in 1971, Griggs versus Duke Power. There was a gentleman or several gentlemen that applied for a promotion within Duke Power, and the promotion required a high school diploma. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, having a high school diploma is not consistent with business necessity. So that's an invalid measure of someone's ability to perform that job. At the time, the gentleman or the group of gentlemen that sued, they were African American. And at the time, there was a much less likely probability that an African American held a high school diploma, at least in the area that these persons lived. So it was seen to have a negative impact on a protected group. Therefore, the practice not having a job-related and consistent with business necessity basis was seen to be invalid. It had a collective discriminatory practice. So once you collect the data on your tests, whether they're entry tests, whether they're applicant flow rates, whether they're promotional rates, you can assess once you have the data. And even if people don't contribute to voluntary data and you have observed data, you can look and say, we've posted this job. We've had 40 females apply and 10 males. We've hired 5 males. We've also hired 5 females. That's equal. Yeah, that's equal, right? So it may not be seen as equal. It may actually produce disparate impact. So if you divide the number of females that applied by the number hired, you get a higher ratio of 12.5%, and the males were hired at a rate of 50%. So that's where this analysis comes into play. If you take your favored group, in this case the males, and compare that favorable group's selection rate to the selection rate of other groups, and mind you, this would apply to gender, to race, to the myriad of protected classes. But if you actually divide the selection rates, you get lower than 0.8. And 0.8 or a 4/5 selection rate was set by the Uniform Guidelines by the EEOC as kind of a benchmark. It's the maybe step. If you see this, there may be adverse impact, and you'll need to do further studies. Usually the EEOC likes a simple standard deviation test where you compare the rates, and if it's less than 2 standard deviations, it's probably okay. If it's 2 or more standard deviations, it's probably, indicating disparate impact. So you've essentially got two that you're contending with here: the disparate treatment. Are your selection processes designed, to treat people equally? And are your selection processes designed to look at outcomes and ensure that people in groups are being treated equally by the tests? So I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions. And I will open up my video, Heather.
I'm not showing any questions currently, but we are open to questions. If you would like to ask any, you are more than welcome to put them in the question and answers or in the chat area.
Okay. Yeah. And I just want to encourage everybody to ask questions. We may not be able to answer every question in this, forum, but we can find you answers. We can get answers to you. So if you think of a question as we're moving along that's not in the specific content bucket, that's okay. We'll record those questions and hopefully try to address them either at the end or one-on-one through your MTAS consultant. I'm seeing, I'm just looking in the chat, I'm not seeing any either. All right, so I'll continue on. I'll go ahead and stop my video for now. Okay, so what we're faced with, we've got some rules to the game, laws, regulations, policies, and so forth. And then we've got the mechanical application of the game itself. And we need to be mindful of how these two things interact. You do not want to run afoul of the rules, the regulations as you move forward. So typically what most employers do when they hire someone, they'll ID a need. They'll identify the need for a staff. They're going to have an opening. They have an opening. Then they advertise the job. They choose candidates. They interview and they select. This is a basic process flow. I want to talk about some steps that are often overlooked by employers when they're choosing people. That choice could be new hires coming into the organization. It could be, a promotional process. So these are some overlooked steps, and they begin with job analysis. So I know many of you have job descriptions. Most of you, all of you, hopefully, have job descriptions in your organization. I would be curious, I'm not going to ask here in this forum, how many of you, though, have updated those job descriptions recently? And also, how many of you borrowed those job descriptions from another city, another employer? Because what happens when you borrow a job description is you look at it and you say, oh yeah, this describes the position. That's what we're going to use. We're going to use that to identify the knowledge, skills, and abilities and other characteristics that are in this job. We're going to use that for our disability inquiries, the ADA inquiries at a medical examiner, but you haven't really looked at the job. So job analysis is important to do. So before you select someone, before you engage them in going for a pre-employment physical, for example, you want to know that your job descriptions actually capture the requirements of the job and the environmental needs of the job, the physical and mental requirements and so forth. I want to talk briefly about KSAOs. It's the knowledge, skill, ability, and other characteristics. The knowledge is what a person knows, what they are required to know to do a job successfully. The skill is what they are, what they can do, what they can demonstrate competence in. The skill in doing things, applying their knowledge. And ability is a combination of knowledge and skill. It's their potential, it's their demonstrated showing of how they apply both knowledge and skill in the job context. Those are all important things to measure when you're selecting or promoting people. Also, other characteristics are important. So other characteristics, for example, if you're hiring someone who is needed to apply knowledge, skill, and ability in a customer service setting, you want to identify a preference or a requirement to have someone who gets along with people, who is good at customer service. So these are your KSAOs, and you'll identify these in a job analysis. You'll perform the job analysis. There's several ways to do that. You can look at prior information on the job. You can look at their current job descriptions and see if they need to be updated. Performance appraisals of good performers. That's another topic altogether, whether or not that information or data is good and valid for inclusion. A good way, though, is to observe the job, but have someone trained in analyzing the job do it, perform the analysis. Usually HR professionals watch incumbents perform the job, someone who's skilled in documenting KSAOs. Gives you good, rich information, or you'll have conversations with people. You'll interview the people that are doing it. You'll interview their direct supervisors on what's needed for the job, or you can use a task questionnaire if you've got several data points that you want to gather. So task questionnaires look a little bit like this. They're typically similar. Gives you the opportunity to document the tasks, the important tasks that are done, how much time they spend doing these tasks, and the percentage of time spent doing these tasks. Also allows you to describe the critical attributes, the job context, the things that need to go well, the things that you need to avoid going poorly in that position. Some people call it a critical incident analysis, but it's really just talking about what the job requires contextually. This is an important thing, especially when you're complying with disparate impact and disparate treatment situations. You want to make sure that the requirements for the position actually reflect what it takes to do the job. If, for example, you're hiring a custodian and you require a high school diploma, but you have several applicants that have no high school diploma, but demonstrate that they can perform the job because they can read, they can write, they can operate all of the equipment, they can follow instructions. They demonstrate that they can do a job, but you've excluded them because they don't have a high school diploma. You're potentially at risk. Also, make sure that the experience level required is actually what is required to do the job, not what is preferred. You can differentiate preferences in your job advertisements, but benchmark it off of the actual requirements for the job. Same for types of skill and/or licensing and certifications required. It's also an opportunity for you to gather information on physical demands and working conditions. This is really important when you're talking about the data and the information that you're going to send to that medical professional who will be analyzing their ability to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. And when you send the job description that captures all of this information, you send it along with just a single form that says this person can or cannot perform the essential functions of the job, and includes the opportunity for the medical professional to highlight any accommodations that they may see that would allow the person. So in addition to all of these processes, you can also look on ONET, and HR Hero has some examples that could be a useful utility when you're looking at some of the basic skill buckets to place some of these jobs in. So these are resources. You've got ONET, you can Google it. It's the federal government's occupational description website. You can keyword search it. And PEP has been kind enough to provide HR Hero free to cities. You can use that as to look at job descriptions. I will caution you to use both of these resources just as templates to help you fill in some gaps. Same as with the HR Hero policy examples. It's always good to supplement them with additional data because they may not be specific to local government. They may not be specific to your city. They may not be specific to the particular job. Often cities will have hybrid jobs where a person does more than one type of function, especially smaller cities that have a utility function that serves sewer, water, gas, and they do all of the above, those type of things. So write your job descriptions to describe the actual tasks, the actual skills and abilities. Any questions at this point?
Not seeing any in the chat or in the question and answer, but we again encourage everyone to submit any questions you may have. We will be answering them as they come in.
Awesome. All right, so we'll move along. I've got one more poll that I would like to have up, Heather. And have you hired? Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I've launched the poll.
Okay. And the question is, have you hired someone thinking this person will do a great job, only to later be disappointed in what they produce?
Looks like we have leveled out with 94% saying yes and 6% saying no.
Okay, well, I'm not surprised by that. If you've been hiring people for any length of time, you've probably made some bad hiring decisions. And it's another foundational step that I want to talk about, predicting job success. So there's some hurdles that I want to talk about. You've got the initial selection hurdle, substantive hurdles, and then making the choice. So the initial selection hurdles typically involve applicant review, resume review, application review. If you've done your due diligence and you've got a really solid understanding of what knowledge, skills, and abilities are required to be entered into the dance contest, then you can sort applicants into qualified or not qualified. I strongly encourage you not to allow unqualified candidates to participate in the selection process. Go ahead and do your due diligence on the front end. That way, when people get to the substantive behavioral hurdles, you vetted them for the knowledge, the skill, and the ability to do that job, regardless of the other characteristics. Friendliness, their ability to get along with other people, they don't matter unless they can actually do the work. So the typical applicant path looks like this. People are applicants. You undergo the initial applicant review hurdle where you qualify them and then turn them into candidates. Only people who are minimally qualified can be candidates. Now, there's a risk to allowing people who are not minimally qualified to being candidates. Let's say you bring someone in who's not qualified because someone in power wants you to include that person for whatever reason, be it political, be it friendly. You've at that point degraded your defensibility, at least on some level, of the requirements of the job. If you're willing to let anyone in, even though they're not minimally qualified, how do you defend that? But you take your candidates through substantive processes. They become finalists. You can employ discretionary steps such as second interviews, other things. They become offer receivers. Offer receivers then take the step to the contingency, and that's where you employ things like drug tests, pre-employment physicals, contingent on successful completion of these things. Then they become new hires. So it's post-offer pre-employment.
We do have a couple of questions that have come in. The first question is, how often do you recommend a job analysis be completed?
Okay, anytime you're creating a new job, clearly. If one has not been done in 2 to 3 years, I would at least review your job descriptions every 2 to 3 years to make sure they make sense. Maybe not go through a thorough job analysis, but you would need to do a thorough job analysis anytime you're creating a new position or the incumbent has been in that position for a significant period of time. They're exiting and you're replacing them. You definitely want to see what's changed, because jobs change all the time. There's a lot of flux in what people do. So you need to document that and make sure that anytime you're looking at promotional processes, selection processes, that you go through a job analysis.
We also have an attendee who wants to hear from the 6% of people who have not been disappointed in someone's work on how they do it.
Magic. The next question, obviously, will the presentation be slides be available later? Yes, those will be made available. All right. And if you in the 6% want to put in the chat how you've done it, how you've successfully done it, feel free. I can't speak for you. Maybe that's a discussion for another time at a round table. But I'm going to move on at this point. All right. So the hiring hurdles, we've got the application and we have to score these applications. It's important that you have mechanisms in place to score applications before you invite them to test. Of course, in this hurdle, you're going to look at their minimum qualifications, the legitimate education and experiential requirements, any required certifications that indicate that they have demonstrated content knowledge that they can employ. And then you invite them to the dance to demonstrate their behaviors. You can also look at biographical data. This is also important because it does give you insight into their time in doing a job, their experience, their context prior to coming into your organization. But be prepared to exclude people that can't meet for the minimum requirements. That's actually absolutely necessary for success. But once you get to the substantive techniques, there are several things. Many employers use written tests. It could be a general intelligence test. It could be, if you're in police and fire, oftentimes they have entry-level police or entry-level fire tests that come from Standard and Associates, IPMA-SCP, other agencies that have done validity testing on these. Now, I will say this, just because you've used a test that's been shown valid does not mean that it's valid for your application. You do need to at least have conversations and be prepared to look at local validity, because if you're ever challenged, IPMA standard, they're going to send you a one-pager that says the Pearson's R correlates to this, or the regression modeling shows this in the construct of our test. But when it comes to your application of the test, you're going to have to defend that individually. There are some personality tests that sometimes are used for selection. The two that come to my mind are the Big Five and the CPI 260. These are valid norm referenced tests. And okay, it's okay to use the Myers-Briggs type indicator, DISC, Enneagram, things like that inside your organization once you have people that are already there and you want to form teams and understand team dynamics, but never, ever use these ipsative tests for selection decisions. And if you go to the Myers-Briggs website, it disclaims that they're not for that use, and do so at your own risk. Of course, they're high fidelity tests, performance tests, where they have to demonstrate the job, and work samples that are high fidelity. These are job simulations, but probably the most frequently used is interviewing. And I want to emphasize that you should use a structured interview instead of an unstructured interview. In an unstructured interview, you don't ask the same questions to all applicants. You make questions up as you go along, and you could run afoul and ask a question that's unlawful, such as, are you planning on joining the military? Do you have kids? Do you have any diseases that we should know about? First of all, never ask any of these questions. Second of all, have good questions that are behaviorally based that you ask every candidate. When it comes to structured interviews, you want to follow some basic steps, some simple steps. First of all, create an interview guide. And if anybody who's been involved with MTAS assessment centers, who's either served as an assessor or used MTAS for these, one thing that you'll see is common. We have a guide. We have an interview guide. We also have scoring matrix. We have benchmarks and so forth that we use. But in this interview guide, you want to talk about what you're going to ask. You want to detail the questions, the standard questions that every candidate gets asked. You want to talk about your scoring criteria, how you're going to score. And scoring criteria relates to a scoring scale, and that scoring scale is tied to behavioral benchmarks, low and high, and hopefully, acceptable levels. And all of these things are tied to job analysis. They go back to your job analysis. They go back to your environmental scan of what it takes to do the job behaviorally and based on knowledge, skills, and abilities. And you incorporate the other characteristics a bit more here because you're looking for some differentiators in how people get along with others or how they communicate. So let's talk a bit about the question and scale example. So when you construct a question, it has a scale example. If you see here, it's got a 5-point Likert scale going from 1 low to 5 high. The question is, tell us about a time when you had to communicate difficult information or feedback to your supervisor. From your job analysis, you've determined what a really good, acceptable behavior would look like. That person would, in their interview, demonstrate that they deliver feedback or information openly, honestly, in a straightforward and respectful manner. They base their information, their statements on strong evidence. They do point out positive aspects of the situation as well. On the opposite end of the scale, I'm going to go ahead and move. Let's go ahead and talk about the next slide. The meets acceptable level of behavior bases their statements on a combination of strong evidence and personal opinion. They incorporate some personal opinion here. So it's a little bit less factual and includes some personal opinion, but they do provide information or feedback, but they don't really suggest solutions. They just maybe complain and walk away a little bit, but not completely. They sometimes provide some critical feedback, but they do so inappropriately. That's pretty normal. So if you go back to the previous acceptable level of behavior, you can see some differentiators. So you take this information from your job description, from your discussions with the people who need this position in their department or in their organization, and you construct differentiators based on behaviors, what's valued. And a lot of these actually are based on what's gone well in the past, what's maybe not gone so well, and what you're looking to have continue or happen differently in the future. So the final scale here is fails to meet acceptable level of behavior. So this person would deliver feedback or information either anonymously or just ask others to do it for them. Sometimes they display aggression or hostility, they withhold key information, and their feedback is not really factual, it's just based on opinion. So you've got these differentiators on how they behave. And given the scoring scale that's based on your job analysis, then you're able to differentiate in the interview process based on the answers they give. Now, I want to caution you, anytime someone gives an answer and they say, well, we did this, press them further, ask them, well, what did you do? How did you approach the situation? Please describe for me a time when you did this. Walk me through it, because you as an interviewer need to know what they actually did and what their behavior. Now, be careful because interviewers do fake. So that's where follow-up questions come into play. You know, I will say this, for a deeper dive on this topic, MTAS, at least in Nashville on March 30th, is piloting a class, an all-day class that starts off understanding your relationship with your personnel policies, your codes, your ordinances, your charter, working through those, navigating those things, and also looking through job analysis. You'll actually work through creating a job description based on some job analysis techniques. You'll put together a basic, real rudimentary selection plan, and then go through some basic rater training, which will kind of get you more used to some of the follow-up questions, as well as going through the interview process. And of course, it'll also look at some compensation and classification basics. So that 8-hour class on March 30th will expose you in greater depth to some of these things. So I encourage you to sign up if you haven't. We'll be taking that class potentially statewide, or at least breaking it into buckets and making it available potentially online. depending on you all and your needs. So you can find that on the MTAS website, the MTAS training links. Look for the information that has already come out or will be coming out in IPMA from MTAS. All right, once we get to the post offer, once you've put this person through the cover charge to the dance, you've made that person come in and do the dance, then you've got some pre-employment hurdles that you've got to satisfy. So we've got another poll coming up here. Do you offer pre-offer drug screens or randoms on everyone?
And this poll has been launched. Still getting some feedback. Looks like we are no 53% and yes 47%.
Okay, so it's a coin flip on whether you do pre-employment drug screen on everyone. All right, so I want to address that topic a little bit. First of all, safety sensitive is permissive. You can always screen, pre-employment screen, randomly screen, post-accident and reasonable suspicion for someone who is safety sensitive. You know, people who have a CDL that's required, that they are required to have a CDL for their job, or they work in on gas pipelines under IPMA-SCP. You can do those. You can permissively test law enforcement, well, police officers, you can test firefighters, you can test street workers. Those are permissive because the safety sensitive position that they staff, if they come to work and they're under the influence, they could have dire effects on the broad population. The Fourth Amendment, however, prohibits, unless it's permissive or required, doing pre-employment or reasonable suspicion on any position. So if the position cannot be classified as safety sensitive, which is permissive to, or is not required, DOT, PHMSA, you really shouldn't be doing drug tests on those positions. So if you're hiring someone who is going to come in and work the front desk at City Hall, they are not safety sensitive. You should not drug test them. If they're a police officer, clearly you can. If they are driving a truck that requires a CDL or working on a gas pipeline, you must on pre-employment random. You can always test people, any person, for reasonable suspicion or post-accident. I also want to highlight that anytime you send someone for a pre-employment medical inquiry, you can get some information on ADA medical inquiries and exams at the Job Accommodation Network. It's askjen.org. It can clarify some information that you may be a little unclear on or have questions on. It's a good resource, and it's provided to us by the federal government. So their information is shared with us.
We have a question about how this applies for Tennessee drug-free workplace.
Okay, I'll address that briefly. Tennessee drug-free workplace was constructed with private sector in mind. The Tennessee drug-free workplace will allow a city to participate in the program and comply with the requirements of the Fourth Amendment. Of course, DFW does not require randoms for participation. Certain federal laws do, DOT, PHMSA. You will get your 5% discount if you participate in a program that the Tennessee Lance Wheaton and the guys and gals over at the Drug Free Workplace program have blessed, and they have blessed the current recommendation, the model drug-free testing, the drug-free workplace policy that MTAS and PEP has worked together with them on. So you can still get the Tennessee drug-free workplace discount and follow these rules. Hope that helps. If you need any further clarification, obviously offline, you can reach out to your HR consultant here at MTAS, and I'm sure you can reach out to your loss control consultants there at PEP. So thank you. Good question. Okay, so Fair Credit Reporting Act, several of you may ask people to submit to credit checks before they come into certain positions. There's some hurdles. I recommend that you use a third-party pre-employment background check company. There are many out there. They do have rights. They have rights to informed consent, right to review the information that you've received. They have the right to be informed when, an adverse employment decision is made, when the pre-employment background check comes back with some flags. They also have a right to appeal any adverse decisions if they believe the data is inaccurate. So for those cash handling positions, for those positions that have access to FACTA information, social security numbers and so forth, and you do the FCRA checks, get a third party to do it, make sure they have a separate informed consent from your typical background check information and so forth. Again, if you need help with that, we're here to help. So moving forward, I want to talk just briefly about personnel policies. I know I've been getting a lot of requests to help cities update their personnel policies. Some cities may have not looked at these in a while. It's important to take a look at them every 2 to 3 years. If you go back to 1998, it was required that cities who have not adopted a personnel policy do so, and it's in TCA 654-123. That policy in and of itself can't grant property interest to employees. Those can arise though from your charter, but we can walk through those. It gives you a list of recommended policies that you include in your personnel policy. It also says that you can work with us, UTM tasks, and we have developed a model policy, and we update that model policy every few years and try to keep it ready for you all to use. We have 100+ sample individual policies, and we can customize those policies to your city's needs, whether you're fewer than 15. If you're fewer than 15, the ADA won't apply. If you're 15 to 20, the ADA applies, but COBRA may not apply. If you're greater than 20 and below 50, Family Medical Leave Act, we can navigate those situations. We can also navigate the due process requirements that come from your charter and help you understand what's required there. So we welcome the opportunity to come help you with any of these things, whether it be helping walk you through job analysis, whether it's helping you put together a selection plan, measuring some of your data, running some basic analysis of your data, taking what you found from your information that you've put into play and helping you put together a good selection process. We're there for you. So I wanted to also, we're running up against our time here. I wanted to give enough time so that people had an opportunity to ask questions. But at this point, I wanted to highlight who our people are that can help you. You see on the screen myself in the middle, and Betsy is in East Tennessee. Peter Voss is in West Tennessee. You can reach them through contact information on the MTAS website. So with that said, I'm going to stop my slide and see if we can entertain any questions.
Please feel free to put your questions in either the question and answer or the chat box, and we'll be happy to address those.
All right. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat box, so we'll give it another second or two. Yes, I see that. We will be looking at new opportunities to get that information out to you, to get maybe some options for attendance virtually. Unfortunately, because of some circumstances, we've had to back up and kind of redirect our efforts a little bit, but we still very much want to get that information, that opportunity to participate out to you. And that was from Fran. She said she received a call from Peter telling her that the meeting on March 29th was canceled because of very few people signing up. So, but we will back up and make that happen. Okay, so Diana says she only heard about the Nashville meeting today. And she would love to attend one closer, and she's in Henderson. So again, we'll try to get that in the works. It may be something that just happens later in the year, depending on logistics. And if logistically it can't happen, we'll put together opportunities for some level of attendance, either virtual or in person. Okay, yeah, Fran says she wishes that the email had been pushed again. It's still a month away. Yeah, the Nashville is a month away. We're 8 days out actually from the East Tennessee, the original ones that were planned in Kingsport. So we had to make a group call on how to address that situation. All right. Seeing no other questions, Heather.
Yes, I think we've exhausted our questions for now. John, thank you for your time and your expertise, and we thank you for joining us today. Our next Partnering for Success webinar will be announced soon. Watch our website and your email for more information on upcoming webinars. And we again thank you for joining us and hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.